Why, hello there. I was recently sent an early sample of Elden Ring, the board game by Steam-Forged Games, the same folks who made Dark Souls, the board game. Elden Ring, the board game, takes one of my favorite video games of all time and adapts it into a cooperative, campaign-based game for 1 to 4 players. Elden Ring, the board game, has 3 starting modules, and I played the Realm of the Grafted King set. The other 2 sets are the Weeping Peninsula and Stormveil Castle. The Realm of the Grafted King set puts players in Limgrave at the start of the game, with the campaign meandering through Limgrave, up the Storm Hills, and into the clutches of the Fell Omen at the gate of Stormveil Castle. This set is beefy. This sucker weighs in at over 16 pounds and contains 54 minis, 6 books, 61 hex tiles, 185 tokens, 1,227 cards,
55 burgers, 55 fries, 55 tacos!
But can this heap of components contain the experience of the Elden Ring video game? Elden Ring, the board game, bites off more than it can chew. In this video I discuss what worked for me, what didn't, and you can decide for yourself if Elden Ring, the board game, and the Realm of the Grafted King set sounds worth your time and money. But before we get into it, please consider subscribing to the channel for more Elden Ring and board game content. Now let's get into it. An unimpeachably good aspect about Elden Ring, the board game, are the miniatures. The Realm of the Grafted King comes with 54 miniatures, and they're gorgeous eye candy for the table. Even in their gray plastic form, they encapsulate the heroes and denizens of Elden Ring with dynamic poses and well-detailed bases. The tokens, card, and hex tiles also look nice, and the art fits for an Elden Ring board game. The encounter and scenario books are also nice and are sturdy, which is more than I can say about the rulebook. The dang thing started falling apart on day 1, but that could just be my book. What I know isn't just my rulebook are the spelling errors and lack of a quick reference for players' turns and decoding the legion of symbols on the cards. Let's talk about the structure of Elden Ring, the board game. It's a campaign-based game in which a party of 1 to 4 players play through different scenarios across multiple sessions with the same tarnished character. And the characters are based on the starting classes from the video game. Players can choose the tough vagabond, the dexterous samurai, intelligent astrologer, and the faithful prophet. There's 30 scenarios in the Realm of the Grafted King, and for this review I played through 8 of them, some multiple times to see how they played solo versus with a party. Scenarios come in 5 different types: non-combat focused narrative and exploration scenarios, and then combat focused dungeon, gauntlet, and boss scenarios. The mix of scenarios I played consisted of 2 narrative, 3 exploration, and 1 of each of the combat scenarios. My roughly 20 hours with these scenarios range from lackluster to kinda exciting, and quite frankly that was not enough to get me invested in finishing what is listed as a 50-hour campaign for the set. The non-combat focused scenarios, the narrative and exploration ones, which made up half of the 8 I played, are primarily what dragged the experience down for me. Let's talk about them. Narrative scenarios put aside the giant box of goods and focus on reading through a choose-your-own-adventure style story. The decisions you make are okay, but sometimes felt like you were being punished for choosing the fun option that felt more in line with the video game. And there's just too much text. The very first mission in the campaign is a narrative mission and is essentially a novelization of the tutorial cave that makes up maybe 10 minutes in the video game. The narrative is over 6 pages long. Keep in mind this features some branching paths, but that's a lot of reading to do out loud with a party. I liked it more solo, but it still felt like I was taking a break from playing a game to do some light reading. What we ended up doing as a group is that I'd say how many paragraphs of text there were, and then read the decision out without further context. This was fine and fun, but obviously not the intended way to play. Next we have exploration scenarios, and they were a real bummer for me. The concept is that your party explores the mysterious and dangerous Limgrave by drawing hex tiles containing different locations from a stack, as you seek to complete quests called Guidances of Grace, before running out of weather cards that track your time and sprinkle in unexpected events. The reality of playing though was playing a game of hide and seek with the randomly sorted map tile stack as we sought to find the tiles with the locations that would let us collect or find the items we needed for the scenario to be over, with fleetingly few meaningful decisions to make along the way. The gameplay is very simple but is bogged down by the multitude of cards and tokens, making every step of the process feel just a bit tedious in a way that really starts to build up over the scenario. The wrinkle to simply laying down tiles and collecting the required quest items are hardship tokens that trigger as soon as a player goes on the hex tile. These often amount to drawing a couple cards from your character's attribute deck and seeing if the sum of the value of the attributes is enough to succeed. The reward for success is not failing, and the penalty for failure is often a point off of your health or focus points. There's no real way to strategize around hardships, you just sort of draw them and deal with them, and there's no real decisions or tactics to be made. To round out a player's turn in an exploration scenario, they draw a weather card, which usually does nothing but act as a tick on the timer of the mission. Even though the weather cards could add some pressure, every exploration scenario I played ended with plenty of weather cards to spare. The tiny bit of spice added to the weather cards is that every once in a while they instruct the player to draw an event card. Events are more interesting, featuring a range of effects, both bad and good. It feels like this is what the hardships should have been, but are instead relegated to an infrequent occurrence. And then your turn is done and it's on to the next player. The video game's open world exploration involves seeing something interesting in the distance and heading towards it, with hijinks ensuing along the way. In Elden Ring, the board game, exploration involves blindly drawing through a stack of map tiles as you go on fetch quests and randomly take on hardships. There's no meaningful decisions to be made, and both as a solo player and in a party it felt like we were doing busy work until the quests were completed. To be fair, there are combat encounters in exploration scenarios. However, there were usually only 2 or 3 randomly spread through the stack of map tiles, and not all players could participate. In exploration scenarios, only the player who interacted with the location is in the combat. That is, unless another player has an effigy of the martyr token that can be collected from map tiles, in which case they can join the combat on their turn. At least I'm pretty sure this is how it works. In one section, the rulebook states that when a player interacts with an enemy encounter, players can decide if they want to join. However, a few paragraphs later, it details the use of an effigy of the martyr token on their turn to join a combat, and I followed these rules because the token otherwise seems pointless. Either way, it's a bummer that the highlight of the exploration scenarios is something that you could just do as a dungeon, gauntlet, or boss scenario instead, without all of the busy work around it. The narrative and exploration scenarios, the non-combat focused scenario types in Elden Ring the board game, just didn't really work for me. Steamforged Games' previous foray into adapting From Software's games, the Dark Souls board game, struggled to translate navigating the world between boss encounters and make it engaging, and this problem persists with the exploration and narrative scenarios in Elden Ring the board game. Dungeon, gauntlet, and boss scenarios are the combat-focused scenarios in Elden Ring the board game, and I had a good time with all of these. Dark Souls the board game struggled to make regular enemy encounters interesting, but the structure of these scenarios, variety of enemy types, and variety of enemy behaviors in Elden Ring the board game delivers interesting tactical situations for players to navigate. Similar to Gloomhaven, combat in Elden Ring the board game happens in encounter books laid on the table. The battlefield is a grid split to the enemy side and the tarnished side. The vertical grid columns are spatial and determine the targets of a given attack. The horizontal rows are more abstract, determining the battlefield position the heroes and enemies are in. Being in the front row at the battle line gives an advantage to dealing damage, being in the middle row lets you manipulate combat order, and hanging out in the back row gives an advantage to defending. This is a departure from the node-based tactics combat of the Dark Souls board game, but it still captures the emphasis on positioning inherent to both Dark Souls and Elden Ring. To represent the character's attack and defense options, there's the combat deck. The combat deck cards are generated from the weapons the Tarnish has equipped, with some room for players to customize which of their weapons' combat cards end up in the combat deck. Players will drop to their maximum hand size from the combat deck at the beginning of the encounter. These cards can be offensive and defensive in nature, with offensive cards being played on the character's turn, and defensive cards being played when they're attacked by an enemy. The randomized mix of attack and defense cards doesn't perfectly emulate the video game's focus on knowing the moveset of your weapons and your character's defensive options, but this is mitigated by being able to discard cards to defend or do a light attack action for lower damage. The combat deck also functions as a more abstract stamina system in a way that I think is pretty neat. Theoretically, a player could spend their 3 actions playing combat cards during their turn, but this would leave them without cards to defend against enemy attacks. Like stamina in the video game, it's up to the player to manage their combat deck effectively and know when to go all out on the offensive and when to brace for the enemy's turn. Similar to Dark Souls, the board game, enemy moves and attacks are dictated by symbols on their marching orders card that is randomly shuffled in with the Tarnish to determine combat order. Like reading an enemy's attack patterns in the game, this gives players perfect information over enemy intentions and allows players to plan ahead. What makes this more dynamic than the Dark Souls board game are a more robust variety of different enemies, combined with a different number of variations of enemy marching order cards that feature different stats and attack patterns, making fights against similar enemy types feel different enough to keep things fresh for at least the first third of the campaign. The gauntlet and dungeon scenarios feature waves of enemies that will appear for a number of rounds, with the dungeon scenarios culminating in a fight against a minor boss. In boss scenarios, the Tarnished take on one of the campaign's marquee bosses in a larger battlefield formed by pushing the 4 encounter books together. Boss fights were the highlight of the Dark Souls board game, and they still are in Elden Ring the board game. Whereas basic enemies have one marching order card that shows how they attack, bosses have multiple cards that will increase with more characters in the party. It makes the interplay between Tarnished turns and boss moves more dynamic between rounds in a way that adds some nice tension to the fights. The trade-off for this approach is that you can see all of the boss's attacks for the round ahead of time, which led to some analysis paralysis with my party as the situation became more dire. While not exactly an emulation of the fast-paced reads of boss moves in the video game, there was satisfaction in effectively solving the combat round by determining where a boss would be and what columns they'll attack during every part of the round, and planning our characters' moves around that. In this way, I think the Dark Souls board game bosses were perhaps a bit more successful in capturing the tension and pace of fighting a boss through memorization of attack patterns that remained hidden, but fighting bosses in Elden Ring the board game was still engaging and perhaps the main thing that would tempt me into playing more scenarios. And there you have it, Elden Ring the board game, Realm of the Grafted King. The campaign system was undeniably the way to go, and I found tweaking my character between scenarios to be Steamforged Game's best implementation of character progression in a From Software board game to date, even if it was just a tad slow for my liking. Where it falls down though is that the non-combat scenarios are just not great. While narrative scenarios are pretty slight, you can at least skim through them. Exploration scenarios end up being the aspect of the game that's most difficult to swallow, as they seem to make up a large portion of the scenarios and components, but they just felt like busy work to me. It's a shame too, because exploration in Elden Ring is such a huge part of what makes the video game great. Capturing the scope and majesty of the digital world in cardboard was always going to be a challenge, but the exploration scenarios as they stand are just not up to the job. The combat scenarios were much more successful, but I'm unsure that they're quite good enough to not only remain highly engaging over the course of the campaign, but to remain engaging and pick up the slack created by the non-combat scenarios. There's a standalone scenario mode that lays out rules for how to build a character for a given scenario as a one-off game, and that sounds like the most interesting way for me to mess around with character builds and check out how Steamforged have adapted the other bosses in Elden Ring the board game. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please give it a like, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more Elden Ring and board game content. Thanks for watching.